Hello everyone, today I will try to make some clarity on all of those activities that we do at the very beginning of foresight practice when we look for the forces of change in the environment, in other words, the building blocks of scenarios, before creating scenario narratives. All of those activities fall under the umbrella term of scanning. However, since there is a plethora of names under that umbrella term, including environmental scanning, horizon scanning, emerging issues analysis, and so on, I will deliberately try to demystify what each term means and involves. And I will focus a lot on the difference between environmental scanning and horizon scanning. A few disclaimers before we start. First, this video is not meant to guide you step by step in the scanning process. Rather, it is meant to introduce you to the scanning activity, to familiarize you with the different names we have to define it, to lift the understandable veneer of confusion that you might have on this, given the chaos in the academic and non-academic literature on it, and yes, also to point out what is crucial when you do scanning. Secondly, given the huge amount of confusion and disagreement in the Futures and Foresight community on what each scanning activity is about, before telling you my take on this, I will lay out each point of view and school of thought as transparently as possible using references. And you will find all of the references I've used to create this video in the description down below. So let's jump right in. The idea of scanning the environment dates back to research done by Francis Joseph Aguilar in the 1960s at Columbia University and documented in his book Scanning the Business Environment. But the first systematic scanning methods were likely used by the Stanford Research Institute and then widely popularized in the business and consulting world throughout the 1970s and 80s. When we think about scanning, perhaps the first term that comes to mind is environmental scanning. Environmental scanning is a term often used by the intuitive logic school of thought, which is a scenario planning school of thought that includes both inductive and deductive scenario planning approaches, mostly used in North America and Europe. Environmental scanning involves the systematic search for the forces of change in the environment that are the very building blocks of scenarios. And according to this definition, these forces of change are largely outside of the control of the organization. And that is why environmental scanning applies really well to corporate foresight and arguably less so to foresight done in governments, because governments have a higher degree of control on the external environment. Now, at this point, you might ask, but what are these forces of change? In other words, what is the object of search in our scanning activity? Well, forces of change are those repeated, lasting, and consistent phenomena that we observe in the external environment in the present that have the potential to change the future. So, for instance, if we're looking at the futures of education, potential forces of change might be the degree to which virtual education technologies are widespread, or the degree to which employers are valuing educational qualifications. Now, regardless this rather agreed upon definition of forces of change are called in many ways. They're called drivers, they're called driving forces, they're called trends, often interchangeably, often not. And there is a huge amount of disagreement in the Futures and Foresight community on which term is best and why. So let's take a closer look at this disagreement. Some practitioners argue that trends are more pervasive and long-term than driving forces, and that driving forces are closer to the industry environment of the organization. According to this point of view, a trend would be, for instance, demographical change, and a driving force would be a technological development in the product line where the firm is operating. Some practitioners say that driving forces and trends are the same. Some other practitioners say that driving forces or drivers are the origin of trends. According to this point of view, a driving force, for instance, would be the decrease in the cost of a product, and the trend would then be the following increase in demand of that product. Some, especially those of the intuitive logic school of thought, argue that we should use the term driving forces rather than trends and drivers, because trends and drivers involve a direction which can actually change. For instance, we should not look at inflation and say it's a trend, because deflation is also possible. Rather, we should look at the underlying driving force, which is the rate of change of the average price level of goods. This last point of view aligns very well with the 2x2 scenario planning method, which uses the term driving force and then leaves the direction of driving forces unspecified until two possible opposite values are given during the creation of scenario narratives. Finally, some practitioners use the term trend, which implies a specific direction, but then stress the importance of finding counter-trends. Personally, I like the term driving forces because that term helps me, even forces me, to think of the counterintuitive, even opposite behaviors of the underlying forces of change, which is so crucial in a scenario planning process and in foresight practice in general. I don't like the term trend too much because that term is often found in media commentaries, newspaper articles, or pop futurist speculations about the future with no references whatsoever. And those articles often tend to overlook the non-trivial, counterintuitive effect of the underlying forces of change. But I think it's okay to use any name as long as we are aware of the fact the underlying forces of change can have a counterintuitive effect. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, we could just call them forces of change. Now, despite these disagreements, most of us in the Futures and Foresight community agree that forces of change have to point towards an outcome in the future. And that is why we also agree that forces of change are not topics, subjects, or events, because topics, subjects, or events cannot point towards an outcome in the future. Let's see why. Forces of change are not topics because topics are too vague to point towards an outcome. For instance, artificial intelligence is not a force of change, it's a broad topic within which many forces of change are to be found, such as the rate of improvement of neural networks, the rate of embeddedness of artificial intelligence technologies in portable devices, and many others. Forces of change are also not subjects or events because subjects and events by themselves are not enough to point towards an outcome, although they often imply an underlying force of change. For instance, Donald Trump, who is a subject, is not a force of change because by himself he will not have the same lasting and consistent impact decades ahead into the future that the underlying force of change will have. And the underlying force of change in this case is the degree of influence of populist political viewpoints around the globe. For the same reason, a particular terroristic attack, which is an event, is by itself not a force of change. Rather, the underlying force of change in this case might be the degree of tension of political conflict or terrorist sentiments globally. However, we can identify forces of change by collecting groups of subjects and events in the social, political, economic environment that point towards the same outcome in the future. Most of us in the Futures and Foresight community also agree that the scanning procedure can be facilitated by using some conceptual frameworks to divide the environment into categories. Perhaps the most common of these frameworks is STEEP, an acronym that stands for Social, Technological, Economic, Environmental, and Political, and that demands that we search for forces of change in each of these 5 domains. Other commonly used frameworks are STEEP-V, which stands for STEEP plus Values, PESTLE, which stands for Political, Economic, Social, Technological, Environmental, and Legal, and many others. Perhaps the most comprehensive framework I've seen is STEPDIAL, which stands for Social, Technological, Economic, Business Methods, Natural Resources, Political, Demographic, International, Legal, and Environmental. All these frameworks can help us to discover forces of change in domains we wouldn't have thought of without the conceptual frameworks in the first place. However, these conceptual frameworks are not analysis tools by themselves. So, for instance, we cannot say that we're doing STEEP analysis. It is more correct to say that we are doing environmental scanning by using the STEEP framework. So now that we know what environmental scanning is, let's take a look at another very commonly used scanning activity in Futures and Foresight, horizon scanning. Many foresight practitioners erroneously believe that horizon scanning and environmental scanning are the same thing, while in reality these are quite different. In fact, proponents of horizon scanning openly criticize environmental scanning because they believe it's excessively focused on the current environment, and that given that the current environment is not going to last too long, they say environmental scanning is too short-term. Proponents of horizon scanning say that forces of change are based on past data, and that focusing too much on them risks creating dull scenarios and being surprised by unexpected phenomena. Instead, proponents of horizon scanning say that to create useful scenarios free of surprises, rather than looking at forces of change, we should look at those issues that have the potential to disrupt forces of change. So what do horizon scanners look for? Well, horizon scanners look for weak signals. Those single examples of change in the present, limited in geographical scope, and of which few people might have heard of, not everybody, that can become, if more widespread, forces of change in the future. For instance, an example of weak signal in the present might be the predominance of virtual second lives over individuals' primary lives. The rationale behind this is that these weak signals, if and when they will expand in the future, they can become future threats, future opportunities, future technological developments, future consumers' needs and habits, and even sources of future conflicts. Therefore, they are more important than forces of change. In other words, when horizon scanners look for the building blocks of scenarios, they don't look for existing forces of change, rather they look for emerging forces of change in the form of weak signals. So as you can imagine, a lot of horizon scanning works focus on looking for technological disruptions, and that is why horizon scanning has often been associated with technological scanning, but in reality, horizon scanners should look for weak signals in all possible dimensions, including the political domain, the social domain, the economic domain, and so on. In fact, similarly to environmental scanning, horizon scanning can actually be facilitated by using conceptual frameworks such as STEEP, STEEP-V, PESTLE, STEP-DIAL, and so on. I also want to point out that given the diversity within the Futures Enforced community, not all of us actually call horizon scanning as such. Some of us call it scanning the periphery. Some others call it looking at the fringes. Some might not even know about the debate between horizon scanning and environmental scanning. However, no matter whether they call it horizon scanning or not, proponents of this approach usually say that when we look for weak signals, we shouldn't look so much at the mainstream where forces of change are, rather we should look at intellectual niches where emerging forces of change originate. Hence the emphasis on reading scientific publications, patents, specialist magazines, or innovation research proceedings. A final thing that further differentiates horizon scanning from environmental scanning is that horizon scanning seems to have been used mostly in governmental foresight settings rather than in corporate foresight settings, and this is likely because of its emphasis on weak signals, which include issues of public concern. So horizon scanning applies really well to policymakers trying to create scenarios of the future with an emphasis on society and technology rather than on the economy, which they are arguably more in control of. In fact, almost all the case studies documenting the application of horizon scanning in the futures and foresight literature are indeed governmental foresight projects. And among the many horizon scanning methods created, perhaps the most famous is emerging issues analysis, which was indeed designed by Graham Molitor, a political scientist and lawyer, specifically for governmental foresight. So let's take a closer look at this method. In emerging issues analysis, we use a curve made of 22 different stages of policy concern to categorize currently emerging issues, that is, weak signals, from very low levels of policy concern on the left side of the curve to very high levels of policy concern on the right side of the curve. This categorization procedure helps us to focus our attention on those issues on the left side of the curve before it's too late, because if they are on the right side of the curve, well, those issues are not only already established, it is also more difficult to solve the problems they bring along. Okay, so now that you know what scanning is in the context of futures and foresight, what all the different names we use in this topic mean, and the difference between environmental scanning and horizon scanning, let me tell you what I think about all this. First, well, of course, I think it's very important that we do both activities that environmental scanning and horizon scanning respectively emphasize. In other words, we need to look for both forces of change as well as weak signals when we create scenarios, because it is the very interplay between the two that will allow us to create interesting, surprising, transformative, but also realistic scenarios. For instance, we might detect a force of change in the increase of virtual communities online, but then we might also detect a weak signal in the form of a social movement somewhere in the world consisting of a group of people who actively detach from social medias and delete their social medias account. So it is the very interplay between those two factors that allow us to create very interesting scenarios. So bottom line, good scenario planners, and in fact good foresight practitioners in general, will merge both approaches. Secondly, I think it is super important to follow up on the scanning process and actually use the output of scanning to create scenarios. Now, this might seem trivial, but in reality there is a worrisome tendency among the proponents of horizon scanning to believe that since looking for weak signals is so important, we don't even need to create scenarios based on them. For instance, in the public sector in Singapore, horizon scanning is not followed by scenario planning because it is believed that horizon scanning is better than scenarios to detect surprises. Well, I dare to disagree. Horizon scanning is better than scenario planning to detect surprises only when scenario planning is very poorly done. A well-done scenario planning project can only enhance the scanning process. This is because of two reasons. The first reason is that horizon scanning is mostly based on desk research, while scenario planning is participatory and collaborative in nature, and that will allow us to include so many viewpoints about the future that horizon scanning simply cannot. The second reason is that the task of writing scenario narratives that we do in a scenario planning process will force us to think of complete words, and that will include so many more aspects about the future that a simple horizon scanning approach cannot do by itself. So if you're interested to know more about how to translate the output of scanning into scenarios, I suggest you take a look at the video I have already produced on the 3 most common scenario planning methods. So if you made it this far and liked this video, I would super appreciate to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I will have so many more videos on the profession, the theories and the methods of futures and foresight coming up in the future. And if you have suggestions, feedback or requests of stuff you want me to cover in the future, just leave it in the comments down below. Thanks so much for listening. Peace out.